On February 12, 1947, the Pike County Sheriff's Office got a telegram asking for medical help at a faraway Kentucky home. The old message talked about problems with having a baby. What it didn't say was that this single birth would lead police to 26 graves with no markers hidden in the Appalachian Mountains. Vera Hutchins, a trained nurse from Pikeville with 7 years of helping with hard births, made the trip on horseback through snowy mountain roads. The way to the Grayson home took nearly 4 hours, winding through valleys where winter fog hung on hemlock branches and ice covered the narrow trails. She arrived just before sunset when the February light was already going away, and the temperature had dropped below freezing. The home itself sat in a hollow surrounded by steep hills that could only be reached by a single dirt path that even in good weather would be hard for most cars. No other house could be seen nearby, and the nearest neighbor lived more than 2 miles away over rough ground. Inside, Vera found the soon-to-be mother Sarah Grayson, in late labor and clearly tired from hours of contractions. The local midwife, an older woman named Mrs. Keller, looked very relieved when Vera arrived. But as Vera began her check-up and got her tools ready, she noticed things that bothered her professional senses. The windows throughout the house had been covered with boards from the inside. Dark stains marked the wooden floor, stains that looked like something living had left them, soaked deep into the wood. And the house smelled wrong, not just of wood smoke and cooking, but of something earthier and more disturbing that Vera couldn't quite name. Sarah's husband, Thomas Grayson, a thin man in his 30s with rough hands and watchful eyes, stayed near the bedroom door but wouldn't come in or answer direct questions about his wife's medical history. When Vera asked about past pregnancies or problems, he simply said that Sarah had always been healthy and walked away. His manner wasn't mean exactly, but avoiding in a way that suggested something more than normal mountain quietness. The birth went through the night with a lot of difficulty. Sarah was weak, possibly not eating enough, and Vera had to use every trick she'd learned to safely deliver a healthy baby girl just after sunrise. As Mrs. Keller cleaned the baby and Vera took care of the mother, Sarah grabbed Vera's wrist with surprising strength. Her whispered words were barely heard. "Count the graves behind the barn." Vera tried to ask her more questions, but Sarah had already fallen into tired sleep. Mrs. Keller, packing her bag to leave now that the emergency had passed, said she hadn't heard anything. Thomas came back to see his daughter, showed no special feelings, and asked when Vera would be leaving. In the pale morning light coming through gaps in the covered windows, Vera Hutchins made a choice that would change everything. She told Thomas she needed to rest before the long trip back to Pikeville, and she planned to find out what was behind that barn. Vera waited until late morning, saying she was tired from the overnight delivery. Thomas had disappeared into the barn, and Mrs. Keller had already begun her trip back down the mountain. When Vera finally stepped outside, the February air cut through her coat, and fresh snow had begun to fall, hiding her footprints as she walked. Behind the barn, partly hidden by wild bushes and a group of bare hickory trees, she found them. 26 river stones arranged in rough rows, each marking a slight low spot in the frozen ground. No names, no dates, just smooth gray rocks that someone had carefully placed. The graves, if that's what they were different lengths. Some looked like children, others adults. The plant patterns told her these weren't recent. Years, possibly decades of growth surrounded the oldest markers. She went back to the house, shaken but keeping her calm. Thomas was waiting on the porch, his look unreadable. Vera thanked him for his kindness and rode back to Pikeville through the growing snowstorm, her mind racing with what she'd seen. But in 1947 rural Kentucky, a nurse's suspicions about river stones behind a barn didn't mean much. She needed someone who could act on what she'd found. Deputy Luther Bingham had worked for Pike County for 15 years, long enough to know every hollow and home in his area. When Vera showed up at his office 3 days after coming back from the Grayson property, he listened with the patience of a man who'd heard many strange stories from the mountains. But something in her detailed story, the exact number of stones and her description of Sarah's whispered warning, caught his attention. Luther looked through the county records, which weren't perfect. The filing system was just ledgers kept by whoever happened to be working in the office, with gaps and mistakes that were common. What he found about the Grayson family seemed unusual to him. The home had been in the family since 1883, passed down through generations who rarely showed up in any official records beyond property tax payments and occasional legal papers. More troubling were the notes scattered across 2 decades. In 1928, a cousin named Edmund Grayson was listed as moved to family property for health reasons. No leaving record existed. In 1932, 2 siblings from a related family, the Morlands, were noted as visiting extended family with no later information. 1937 brought another entry, temporary resident for harvest work with a name that had been poorly written down and no follow-up information. 8 people over 20 years, all connected somehow to the Grayson home, all with unclear reasons for being there and complete silence about when they left. By itself, each entry seemed unremarkable. Mountain families helped each other through hard times, took in relatives during tough periods, hired traveling workers when needed. But together, looked at through what Vera discovered, the pattern suggested something far more disturbing. Luther closed the ledger and looked at the nurse sitting across from his desk. The law in 1947 Kentucky had big limitations, especially in faraway areas where being alone bred independence and distrust of outside authority. He couldn't simply ride up to the Grayson property and demand answers based on river stones and unclear record keeping. He needed more, something solid that would justify official involvement. He began making quiet questions, starting with families whose names appeared in those old ledgers. Most lived in neighboring counties now scattered across eastern Kentucky and into West Virginia. The conversations would take weeks, maybe months, but Luther Bingham had learned patience in these mountains, and Vera Hutchkins' story had planted a seed of fear that he couldn't ignore. 26 stones behind a barn and 8 names in incomplete records. The math alone demanded answers. Luther's first interview took him to Harlan County, where he found Margaret Stillwell living in a small house near the coal mines. She was 61 years old, her hands twisted from decades of washing clothes and caring for gardens. When Luther mentioned the Grayson family, her face tightened. Her sister Ruth had gone to help at the home during the harsh winter of 1932. The Graysons needed help caring for Thomas's sick grandfather, and Ruth, unmarried and known for her nursing skills, had volunteered. She was 34 years old, healthy and strong. The family got one letter 6 weeks after she arrived, brief and oddly formal, saying she decided to move to Cincinnati for factory work. Ruth had never mentioned any interest in city life. She'd been scared of crowds since childhood. Margaret showed Luther the letter, yellowed with age but carefully kept. The handwriting looked similar to Ruth's but somehow different. The letters more cramped, certain words misspelled that Ruth would never have gotten wrong. Margaret had written to the Cincinnati address given. Her letters came back marked address unknown. She'd contacted the Graysons twice asking about her sister's location. Both times, Thomas's father had responded shortly that Ruth had left on her own, and they knew nothing more. In Letcher County, Luther found Harold Keene, whose younger brother Vincent had taken a job with the Graysons in 1937 for harvest season. Vincent was 22, saving money to marry his sweetheart in Pike County. He'd promised to return by October. When November came with no word, Harold had ridden to the Grayson property himself. Thomas's father, Cyrus, met him at the property line with a shotgun, not raised in threat but present. Cyrus explained that Vincent had decided to move on, heading west for better opportunities. He'd been paid his wages and had left 3 weeks before. Harold asked why Vincent hadn't written or stopped home first. Cyrus shrugged, said young men get wanderlust, and suggested Harold stop asking questions that weren't his business. The shotgun never moved, but its presence delivered a clear message. The pattern repeated across 5 more families. A niece who went to help with spring planting in 1941, a cousin's husband looking for temporary work in 1929, a traveling salesman who'd stopped at the property in 1935 and whose sample case later turned up left behind on a roadside 20 miles away. Each disappearance came with a thin explanation, a sense of wrongness that families couldn't put into words but deeply felt, and a wall of silence from the Graysons that discouraged more questions. What came out of Luther's investigation wasn't proof exactly, but a picture of absence. People drawn to that isolated hollow by family duty, money needs, or simple circumstance vanishing into silence. The Grayson property had become a kind of black hole, pulling people in and offering only hollow explanations for why they never came out. Luther put together his notes across 6 weeks of interviews. 8 names from official records now grew to 13 through family stories. 13 people across 18 years, all connected to that home, all gone without believable trace. The math alone of so many people independently choosing to cut off all family contact after visiting the same place didn't make sense. He returned to Pikeville with his findings and went directly to Sheriff Raymond Vance. The sheriff listened, read through Luther's careful notes, and stared out his office window at the distant mountains. After a long silence, he reached for his telephone. What Luther had uncovered might not be legal proof, but it was enough to justify a welfare check. They would visit the Grayson property together, officially and with authority, and they would look behind that barn. Sheriff Vance and Deputy Bingham arrived at the Grayson home on March 27, 1947, along with 2 additional deputies and the county coroner, Dr. William Hastings. The approach was deliberate and official, their vehicles driving the dangerous mountain road in a line that announced their purpose: Thomas Grayson met them on the porch, his wife Sarah visible through the window holding their baby daughter. Vance explained they were doing routine welfare checks on faraway properties and wanted to look around the property. Thomas's jaw tightened, but he stepped aside. Kentucky law gave limited protection against such searches when officials had reasonable cause, and the sheriff's presence made refusing unwise. The men moved through the house carefully, noting the boarded windows, the stains Vera had mentioned, and a strange musty smell that seemed to come from the cellar. Luther looked at the cellar door. A heavy padlock secured it, unusual for a simple storage space. When asked for the key, Thomas hesitated before pulling it from his pocket. The cellar showed typical supplies: jars of preserved vegetables, salted meat, but also a smaller door set into the far wall, partly hidden behind stacked crates. This door had no outside lock, only a heavy bolt that locked from the outside. Behind it, they found a windowless room about 8 feet square. The dirt floor was packed hard from use. Iron rings had been bolted into the wooden supports at different places. The smell here was worse. A combination of human waste, fear, and something older that had soaked into the very walls. Hastings came out of the space looking shaken, confirming what they all suspected. This room had held people, likely for long periods. Sheriff Vance placed Thomas under immediate arrest and ordered a complete search of the property. What they discovered behind the barn transformed suspicion into horrible certainty. 26 river stones, exactly as Vera had described, marking low spots in the ground that formed an unmistakable pattern. The sheriff ordered digging to begin immediately. The first grave gave up human remains wrapped in old canvas. Dr. Hastings, whose experience was mainly farm accidents and natural deaths, found himself looking at evidence of violence. The skull showed clear injury. Fabric pieces suggested clothing from at least a decade before. By nightfall, 3 graves had been opened, each containing human remains in different states of decay. Word spread through the mountain communities with scary speed. By the next morning, families who'd lost contact with relatives began arriving at the property, hoping for answers but dreading confirmation. The digging continued for 5 days, each grave showing another victim. The oldest burials, based on decay and soil tests, dated back at least 20 years. The most recent appeared to be from within the past 2 years. Personal items found in the graves gave the first solid identifications. A wedding ring carved with initials that matched Ruth Stillwell's. A pocket watch belonging to Vincent Keene, its gears frozen at 3:30. A woman's locket holding photographs of children who would now learn their mother had never abandoned them as they'd been told. Thomas Grayson stayed silent in custody, using his right against self-incrimination. But silence couldn't protect him from the evidence literally being dug up from his property. As the final count reached 26 confirmed burials, Sheriff Vance expanded the investigation. If Thomas had continued his father's work, then Cyrus Grayson, dead 5 years, had likely started it. The question became how far back the horror went, and whether anyone beyond Thomas shared responsibility. Sarah Grayson, holding her newborn daughter, was taken into protective custody. Her testimony would prove very important, but for now she seemed locked in shocked silence, unable or unwilling to speak about what she'd seen in that isolated hollow where 26 people had been buried like unwanted secrets in the frozen Appalachian ground. The identification process took weeks as forensic specialists from Lexington worked alongside Dr. Hastings to match remains with missing person reports. Dental records, when available, gave the most reliable confirmations. Clothing pieces, jewelry, and personal items filled in gaps where formal records failed. By late April, investigators had identified 19 of the 26 victims. Ruth Stillwell, the woman who'd gone to care for a sick grandfather in 1932, was confirmed through her wedding ring and dental structure. She'd been 34. Vincent Keene, identified by his pocket watch and a distinctive bone break he'd had as a child, had been 22. The salesman from 1935 was Edmund Talbot, 41, whose sample case had been found abandoned. His company had filed a missing person report that had gone nowhere. 3 victims were children, the youngest guessed at 14 years old. This discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation. Children suggested family members, not traveling workers or distant relatives. Records showed that Thomas's younger sister, Anna, had supposedly moved to Virginia in 1939 at age 16. His cousin's daughter, Lily, had supposedly gone to live with an aunt in Tennessee in 1941 at 15. Both girls were now confirmed among the dead. The geographic scope expanded investigators' understanding. Victims had come from 5 different states. A traveling preacher from West Virginia who'd been making rounds through isolated communities in 1938, a young couple from Mace, Tennessee, newlyweds looking for work who'd answered an advertisement for harvest help in 1943, a widow from Ohio who'd written with Cyrus Grayson about buying preserves and had traveled to the property in 1936 to do business in person. Luther Bingham reconstructed how the Graysons had kept their supply of victims. The home's isolation worked in their favor, but they'd also actively built connections. Cyrus had placed advertisements in area newspapers looking for seasonal workers. He'd kept up letter writing with distant family members, sending invitations for visits or help. Thomas's mother, who died in 1934, had belonged to a quilting circle that connected women across 3 counties, giving social cover and potential contacts. The property itself had served multiple jobs in this system of death. The locked room in the cellar had held victims for days, sometimes weeks. Forensic evidence suggested forced labor. People made to work the property under threat or restraint before their eventual murder. The Graysons had basically operated a system of captivity and use, hidden behind the front of an isolated but unremarkable mountain family. 7 victims remained unidentified despite exhaustive efforts. Their remains suggested ages ranging from late teens to 60s, but without dental records or distinctive personal items, their names stayed lost to history. These unnamed dead haunted the investigation, representing the most complete erasure the Graysons had achieved. People so completely vanished that even death couldn't restore their identities. The Kentucky State Police set up a formal task force by May, recognizing that the case's scope exceeded local resources. Regional newspapers published photographs of recovered jewelry and clothing items. Desperate attempts to spark recognition from families who might not have filed official reports. In the 1920s and 30s especially, poor rural families often lacked the resources or knowledge to navigate official missing persons channels. Their relatives had simply disappeared, and they'd grieved privately, never imagining the systematic horror that had claimed them. As spring turned to early summer, investigators began digging areas beyond the marked graves. Ground-penetrating technology didn't exist in rural Kentucky in 1947, so they relied on soil disturbances, plant patterns, and property surveys. They found 3 additional burial sites in a wooded area beyond the barn, bringing the potential total to 29. The nightmare, it seemed, ran even deeper than those 26 river stones had suggested. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While searching the main house in early June, investigators discovered a metal strongbox hidden under floorboards in what had been Cyrus Grayson's bedroom. Inside lay a collection of documents that would provide the most chilling evidence yet. Journals covering 23 years, written in Cyrus's careful hand. The earliest entries dated to 1924, 3 years before the first confirmed victim. Cyrus wrote about his father's teachings, lessons about protecting the family bloodline from corruption and weakness. He described the home as sacred ground that needed defending from outsiders who would dilute their heritage or exploit their isolation. The ideology was twisted, a paranoid philosophy that saw anyone outside the immediate family as potential threats to be eliminated. By 1927, the entries shifted from abstract philosophy to concrete action. Cyrus documented the arrival of a hired hand named Joseph Brennan, aged 26, who'd come for tobacco harvesting. The journal entry noted Brennan's loose morals and disrespectful attitude. 2 weeks later, Cyrus recorded Brennan's death with clinical detachment, describing the method, burial location, and estimated depth of the grave. No guilt, no moral struggle, just documentation like a farmer recording livestock inventory. The journals revealed a systematic approach. Cyrus categorized his victims by how much of a threat he thought they were. Family members who questioned his authority or showed signs of leaving got the harshest treatment. Outsiders who arrived looking for work were judged for useful labor before their disposal. Women were sometimes kept longer, forced into household work. The length of captivity varied from days to months, depending on the victim's usefulness and the risk of discovery. Thomas appeared in the journals starting in 1938 when he turned 18. Cyrus wrote about bringing his son into the family's necessary work, teaching him the same lessons about purity and protection. The entries suggested Thomas at first resisted but gradually accepted his father's worldview. By 1942, Thomas was making his own decisions about who posed threats and needed elimination. One entry from 1943 detailed the murder of the Tennessee newlyweds with disturbing precision. Cyrus described how they'd answered an advertisement for harvest work, arrived with hope and energy, and were separated within days. The husband was worked until exhaustion, then killed when he grew too weak for labor. The wife was held longer, forced to cook and clean before meeting the same fate. Cyrus noted their burial locations with directions relative to property landmarks. The journals also explained gaps in victim identification. Cyrus sometimes burned personal items or buried them separately from bodies, deliberately destroying evidence that might enable future identification. He saw this as additional protection, making certain victims vanish so completely that even their deaths would remain anonymous. Those 7 unidentified remains represented his most successful erasures. Sarah Grayson's involvement emerged through later entries written by Thomas after his father's death in 1942. Thomas mentioned Sarah's awareness and occasional participation in holding victims or getting rid of evidence. The entries suggested she'd been forced at first but had grown complicit over time, trapped by fear, isolation, and gradual normalization of horror. The journals gave prosecutors with devastating evidence but also raised disturbing questions. How many additional victims existed before 1927? Cyrus's father had supposedly taught him these methods, suggesting the pattern might go back to the 1880s when the family first settled the property. The journals mentioned father's work and continuing the tradition, implying this wasn't Cyrus's innovation but inherited practice spanning generations. The true scope might never be known, buried too deep in time and earth to ever recover. The investigation's expanded scope brought families from across the region to Pike County throughout the summer of 1947. The courthouse became an informal gathering place where relatives compared photographs, shared memories of lost loved ones, and found grim solidarity in their shared grief. Margaret Stillwell met Harold Keene, discovering their siblings had likely been held captive at the same time in 1937 before their murders. Newspaper coverage transformed the case into national news. The Louisville Courier-Journal ran a front-page story in July with the headline, "Mountain Horror, Decades of Murder in Kentucky Hollow." The Cincinnati Enquirer published victim profiles, humanizing the dead beyond just statistics. Radio broadcasts carried updates as investigators continued digging the property and surrounding woodland. The Grayson case became shorthand for a particular kind of rural American nightmare. Isolation turned predatory. Law enforcement agencies across Appalachia began reviewing their own cold cases. In West Virginia, authorities reopened investigations into 3 missing persons who'd last been seen traveling through eastern Kentucky. Tennessee officials identified 2 unsolved disappearances with potential Grayson connections. The ripple effect revealed how porous law enforcement had been across state lines in earlier decades, how easily people could vanish in the gaps between jurisdictions. The State Police Task Force put together a comprehensive timeline by August. They confirmed 29 victims through physical evidence, with strong circumstantial cases for 6 additional disappearances that lacked conclusive proof. The earliest confirmed murder dated to 1927, but Cyrus's journals suggested his father's involvement in similar crimes as far back as the 1890s. If true, the Grayson family's systematic violence had continued for at least 50 years across 3 generations. Geographic analysis revealed the calculated nature of victim selection. Most came from beyond Pike County, reducing local scrutiny. The Graysons had exploited regional economic desperation during the Depression when people traveled long distances for any promise of work. They'd manipulated family obligations, convincing relatives that visits were necessary while knowing those visitors would never leave. They'd preyed on traveling salesmen, preachers, and itinerant workers whose movements made their disappearances less immediately suspicious. The case also exposed systemic failures in missing persons investigations. During the 1920s and 30s, especially rural law enforcement operated with minimal resources and training. When poor families reported relatives missing, investigations rarely extended beyond basic inquiries. Class prejudice played a role as well. Authorities often assumed that poor people simply moved on, seeking opportunities elsewhere rather than considering foul play. Hastings completed his forensic analysis by September, determining causes of death for most victims. Blunt force trauma was most common, suggesting beatings or strikes with tools. Several victims showed signs of long-term malnutrition and physical abuse consistent with forced labor and captivity. 3 had been shot, executions rather than murders done in rage. The clinical nature of the violence reinforced what the journals revealed. This was systematic killing done with cold purpose rather than passion. Sarah Grayson finally broke her silence in late September after months of protective custody. Her attorney negotiated testimony in exchange for consideration during sentencing. What she revealed added texture to the documentary evidence. She described daily life on the property, the locked room where victims were held, Thomas's methodical approach to selecting and getting rid of people he thought were threatening. Her account confirmed that she'd been terrorized into compliance, but had eventually participated in holding victims and destroying evidence. The prosecution now had overwhelming evidence for trial. 29 bodies, detailed journals documenting murders, forensic evidence of systematic violence, and eyewitness testimony from someone inside the household. Thomas Grayson's defense attorney faced an impossible task, and the entire region waited to see justice delivered for crimes that had festered in mountain isolation for half a century. The trial began on October 6, 1947, in the Pike County Courthouse, a building never designed to accommodate the national attention now focused upon it. Judge Harold Pritchard presided, a veteran of 20 years on the bench who understood the weight of what would unfold. Thomas Grayson sat beside his attorney, Raymond Hicks, a competent defender facing a case no legal strategy could salvage. Sarah Grayson would be tried separately after her testimony concluded. Prosecutor James Caldwell opened with devastating simplicity. He placed 29 photographs on the evidence table, each showing recovered remains. He read names of identified victims, pausing after each to let the reality settle. For the unidentified, he simply stated unknown woman, approximately 30 years old, or unknown man, late 50s. The courtroom held over 200 people, including families of the dead, journalists from a dozen newspapers, and curious observers who'd traveled from neighboring states. The prosecution's case carefully built through 2 weeks of testimony. Dr. Hastings described forensic findings, explaining injury patterns and estimated times of death. Luther Bingham walked the jury through his investigation, the pattern of disappearances, and the moment they discovered those river stones behind the barn. Sheriff Vance testified about the locked room, the iron rings, the evidence of long captivity. Each witness added another layer to an undeniable narrative of systematic murder. Cyrus's journals provided the most damning evidence. Caldwell read selected entries aloud, his voice steady as he told of clinical descriptions of killings. The jury heard about Joseph Brennan in 1927, about the Tennessee newlyweds in 1943, about Thomas's sister Anna, whose own brother had participated in her murder in 1939. The courtroom remained silent except for occasional sobbing from victim families. Even hardened journalists struggled to maintain professional detachment. Sarah Grayson's testimony took 3 full days. She described meeting Thomas in 1941, marrying him despite her family's concerns about his isolation and odd behavior. Within months of moving to the home, she discovered the truth. Thomas had shown her the cellar room, explained his father's teachings about protecting the bloodline, and made clear that leaving meant death. She'd witnessed 4 murders during her 6 years there, been forced to help get rid of evidence, and lived in constant terror that she'd be next. The defense tried to portray Thomas as a victim of his father's indoctrination, a man raised in such twisted ideology that he couldn't tell right from wrong. Hicks called a psychiatrist from Louisville who testified about generational trauma and environmental conditioning. But cross-examination revealed Thomas's active participation in planning murders, his continuation of the practice after Cyrus's death, and his elaborate efforts to hide evidence. The insanity defense crumbled under the weight of premeditation and systematic execution. Sarah's defense proved more complex. Her attorney, Marcus Fenway, argued coercion and duress, painting her as another victim trapped by Thomas's violence and the property's isolation. Prosecutors countered with evidence of her active participation. Testimony suggesting she'd helped hold victims, her role in faking letters to families, her failure to seek help during rare trips to town for supplies. After 6 weeks, both cases went to separate juries. Thomas's verdict came first, guilty on the 29 counts of first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted in release, families weeping, journalists rushing to telephones. Sarah's jury deliberated longer, struggling with the complexity of victimhood versus complicity. They returned guilty verdicts on accessory to murder for 12 counts and complicity in 4 deaths, where evidence showed direct participation. Sentencing would determine whether Thomas faced execution or life imprisonment, whether Sarah received any mercy for her forced involvement. Judge Pritchard scheduled the hearing for November 15th. Giving both sides time to prepare arguments about appropriate punishment for crimes that had shocked the nation. The sentencing hearing on November 15th drew even larger crowds than the trial itself. Families of the victims packed the courthouse, many having waited months for this moment. Margaret Stillwell held a photograph of her sister Ruth, refusing to let the woman be reduced to a name on a court document. Harold Keene sat beside her, carrying Vincent's pocket watch, its hand still frozen at 3. Prosecutor Caldwell argued for the death penalty with controlled intensity. He reminded the court of 29 lives systematically extinguished, of children murdered by their own family, of people who'd come seeking honest work or offering help, and found only captivity and death. He described the locked cellar room, the years of terror, the calculated deception that allowed the murders to continue across decades. This wasn't a crime done in passion or desperation, but methodical elimination of human beings thought inconvenient or threatening to a twisted ideology. Defense attorney Hicks made his final argument for life imprisonment, citing Thomas's indoctrination from childhood and the absence of any life experience outside his father's poisonous teachings. He argued that executing Thomas wouldn't restore the dead or prevent similar crimes, that life in prison offered appropriate punishment without making the state complicit in taking another life. His argument was professional and thorough, but even he seemed to recognize its futility against the magnitude of evidence. Judge Pritchard deliberated for 2 hours before returning to the bench. The courtroom fell silent as he addressed Thomas directly. He spoke about the sanctity of human life, the betrayal of trust when people seeking help found murder instead, and the particular evil of violence hidden behind the facade of family and isolation. His voice remained steady as he pronounced sentence. Death by electrocution for each of the 29 murder convictions, to be carried out at the Kentucky State Penitentiary. The sentences would run concurrently, but the symbolic weight of 29 death penalties underscored the scope of horror. Sarah's sentencing followed immediately. Fenway made an impassioned plea for leniency, emphasizing her status as a victim who'd been terrorized into compliance. He noted she'd ultimately testified against Thomas, providing crucial evidence that secured convictions. Caldwell countered that complicity in murder, regardless of motivation, demanded significant punishment, that fear didn't absolve her of responsibility for the deaths she'd helped facilitate. Judge Pritchard sentenced Sarah to life imprisonment with possibility of parole after 20 years. He acknowledged the complexity of her situation, but stated that her participation in concealing murders and destroying evidence represented criminal conduct that couldn't be excused entirely by duress. She would serve her sentence at the Kentucky Correctional Institution for Women, separated from her infant daughter, who'd been placed with Sarah's sister in Virginia. The courtroom cleared slowly, families lingering as if reluctant to leave this space where justice had finally happened. Outside, journalists interviewed relatives, capturing their relief mixed with enduring grief. Margaret Stillwell told reporters that no sentence could return Ruth. But knowing the truth after 15 years of wondering brought its own painful peace. Beyond the immediate case, the reverberations extended into policy and practice. The Kentucky State Police established new protocols for investigating missing persons in rural areas, recognizing how isolation had enabled decades of murder. Other Appalachian states implemented similar reforms, training officers to look beyond surface explanations when people vanished from remote communities. Social workers began regular welfare checks on isolated homes, though the practice faced resistance from families who valued their independence and privacy. The Grayson property became a subject of debate. Some argued for preservation as a memorial to the victims. Others insisted it should be destroyed completely to prevent morbid tourism. In January 1949, the county authorized demolition. The buildings were torn down, the cellar filled with concrete, and the land left to return to wilderness. Only the burial area remained marked. 29 simple stones replacing the original river rocks, each now bearing a name or the inscription, known only to God. Thomas Grayson was executed on June 3, 1949, at the Kentucky State Penitentiary. He never spoke publicly about his crimes beyond a brief statement claiming he'd done what was necessary to protect his family's legacy. 27 people witnessed the execution, including Sheriff Maines, Deputy Bingham, and 3 family members of victims who'd requested to attend. His death closed one chapter but left questions that would haunt researchers for generations. In the decades following the trial, historians and criminologists returned repeatedly to the Grayson case, seeking to understand how such systematic horror had continued undetected for so long. Dr. Eleanor Vasquez, an anthropologist from the University of Kentucky, conducted extensive research in the 1960s, interviewing neighbors and distant relatives who'd known the family. Her findings revealed a community that had sensed something wrong but lacked language or framework to articulate their suspicions. The Graysons had been regarded as odd, reclusive, perhaps unnaturally protective of their isolation, but nothing that demanded intervention. The case fundamentally altered how law enforcement approached missing persons in isolated communities. By the 1950s, Appalachian states had implemented mandatory follow-up procedures for disappearances in rural areas, requiring officers to conduct property searches and interview multiple witnesses rather than accepting family explanations at face value. These reforms came too late for the Grayson victims, but potentially prevented similar crimes from taking root elsewhere. Archived documents examined in the 1970s suggested the pattern might indeed go back to the 1880s, as Cyrus's journals had implied. Property records showed the original Grayson patriarch, Ezekiel, had acquired several nearby parcels under suspicious circumstances, claiming previous owners had abandoned them or sold out suddenly. Local newspaper accounts from the 1890s mentioned occasional disappearances of travelers in that region, though without explicit connection to the Grayson property. Definitive proof remained elusive, but circumstantial evidence painted a disturbing possibility of multi-generational violence spanning 70 years. The infant born during Vera Hutchkins' visit, the child whose birth had ultimately exposed the murders, grew up far from Kentucky's mountains. Adopted by Sarah's sister and given a new name, she lived a quiet life in Virginia, never returning to the hollow where her father had committed atrocities. Journalists occasionally tried to contact her, seeking perspective on her unusual legacy, but she consistently declined interviews. Her silence seemed less about shame than a determination not to let her father's crimes define her existence. Sarah Grayson died in prison in 1973 at age 56, having served 26 years. She'd been denied parole 3 times, the board determining her complicity outweighed her victimhood. In her final years, she taught literacy classes to other inmates. A small redemption in a life marked by terrible choices and circumstantial tragedy. Her daughter never visited, a decision that prison counselors understood as necessary self-preservation. The burial site where 29 victims finally received proper rest became an unofficial memorial maintained by local historical societies and occasionally visited by descendants of the dead. In 1997, on the 50th anniversary of the investigation, a formal marker was installed bearing all 29 names with the inscription, "Gone but not forgotten." Truth revealed 1947. The Grayson case remains studied in criminal justice programs as an example of how geographic and social isolation can enable systematic violence when combined with law enforcement limitations and community blind spots. It illustrates the importance of victim advocacy, thorough investigation of missing persons regardless of economic status, and the danger of dismissing suspicions about isolated families as just cultural difference or legitimate desire for privacy. Vera Hutchkins, whose courage in reporting what she'd witnessed started the entire investigation, continued nursing until her retirement in 1972. She rarely spoke publicly about the case, but in a 1985 interview shortly before her death, she reflected that sometimes evil continues simply because good people lack the knowledge or courage to confront it. Her decision to trust her instincts and seek help had given 29 victims their names back and their families a truth that, however painful, was better than endless wondering. So if this case teaches us anything, it's that isolation can hide the darkest secrets, but truth has a way of surfacing when people refuse to look away. If this story moved you, disturbed you, or made you think differently about the missing and forgotten, show your support by clicking that like button and subscribing. We're committed to bringing these buried stories to light, honoring victims who deserve to be remembered. Share this video with someone who appreciates true crime told with respect and depth. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, and never stop seeking the truth.